Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio that you can hear every weekday on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM at 4:30 Eastern. We're joined right now by Wes Anderson. He is VP of Agronomy of Croptimistic Technology based out of Australia. Hey, Wes, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm good, Sean. Thanks.
Okay, now Wes, you caught my attention. I was scrolling through LinkedIn. I was killing some time, having a glass of wine, and I saw you post this comment. Okay, we're gonna talk about what you mean by this and the why of it. The more soil tests I see, the more I realize that there is too much focus on variable rate nitrogen and not enough focus on the VR of other nutrients, lime, gypsum, targeted drainage, and even VR pesticides. You're just not going to fix a nutrient imbalance with more N. Let's talk about that and what you're seeing, Wes, and what prompted you to post that.
Yeah, well, I've recently put together the ability to run some pretty high level analytics and all of our soil data that our team in Western Canada is taking this fall. Just our own team under Croptimistic, none of our partners, but we cover a lot of acres right across Western Canada and not including the Peace, but it's a lot of samples, and I was looking at some of the ranges of nutrients that we see and whatnot, and of course analyzing it by SWAT zone and that sort of thing. And it's fascinating, and the number of samples we're starting to see that are critically low, and I mean I'm some seriously low in things like potassium, phosphate, even zinc and copper. pH is a really emerging issue, and I know other soil scientists have talked about this as well in some publications in the last year or two. We're starting to see some really bad issues from acid soils. So there's a lot more to talk about than just nitrogen, which has gotten a lot of the focus, and especially with variable rate, and I get it. It's been the big expense probably, and the nutrient we apply the most of, but it's certainly no more critical than the other ones.
Yeah, it tends to be the one that when we think about and talk about yield,
Yeah.
that's the one that everybody jumps to first, and so it really does get a lot of the focus. Is that kind of the why of it?
Yeah, for sure. And it's the one that gets often anyway the most visual crop response, right? And we all like to see things. But the reality is, like, there's heaps and heaps of data, and like some of it goes back to the 60s and 70s even, when some of the best old soil fertility researchers started doing their thing, right? And there's lots of data to show that when something else is limiting, whether it's phosphate or potassium or sulfur, that end response curve tends to flatten out really early, right? And you max out the nitrogen or yield response from nitrogen at relatively low rates when something else is limiting. And so we can't look at each nutrient alone, right? They're not mutually exclusive. You've got to really take a holistic viewpoint of the whole thing. And some of it's complicated. I get it. Like, you get into the soil chemistry in regards to pH and some of those pH extremes. I was just looking at our data this morning. Like, if I look at our whole data set, all zones, all soil zones, etc., our topsoil pH ranges from 4.4 to 8.7, right?
Wow.
And that's just in Western Canada. See, we're getting more and more of those samples that are below 5 pH. And then keep in mind, none of those are from the Peace Country either. You go up into the Peace Country. I was just talking to one of our partners up there yesterday, actually, and he's seeing these similar issues. They got lots of acid soils that are causing a lot of issues around aluminum toxicity and manganese toxicity. So got to be thinking about all that stuff.
Now, Wes, on the pH comment, is is that pH range? Is that how it's always been, or is there certain things that we're doing that is dropping that number?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Sean. So I think, there's some areas like northern Alberta, maybe the northern fringe of Saskatchewan even, and the Peace Country. They've always had some acid soils, even in the early days of fertilizer use, right? So that's just a natural parent material thing. long term, over thousands of years of soil development, there's been acidification occurring on those gray luvisols. But yeah, fertilizer use and just simply crop removal and rainfall over time all contribute to acidification. So we see some very clear trends in our data by our management zones, our SWAT zones, where those, like say in northern Alberta, for example, we tend to get a lot of like sandier knolls with low organic matter in the upper landscape positions. The lower landscape positions tend to have deep black soils, high organic matter, more clay content, lots of buffering capacity that resist that acidification over time. So then what you get is a trend from sort of SWAT zone 1 to 10, upper
Yeah.
landscape position, a lower landscape position, of lower pH to higher pH generally, right? There's every field's different. There's always some exceptions, but yeah, I mean, we would regularly see fields that have pH of 5.5 to 7.5 in northern Alberta, for example. That's quite common. And then, of course, we get those extremes where we're getting those sandy knolls that have been acidified. And a lot of the time, when you dive into some fertilizer or management history, a lot of those fields have had a lot of canola with a lot of ammonium sulfate
Mm.
applied at very high rates. So you get in the Edmonton area, for example, lots of cheap ammonium sulfate fines. Farms sometimes think or get sold in the idea that, oh, it's cheap nitrogen. I'll, hammer on 150 pounds an acre or 200 pounds an acre. Why not? Really, there's some instances where we're probably starting to do more harm than good by overuse of some of those products that are contributing to that.
You mentioned also seeing low phos.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Yeah, so low phosphates, a bit of a difference. That's more into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, some parts of southern Alberta more so. That one again is mostly, I would say, related. Some of it's related to some high pH soils, especially in the east. But um, for the most part, we have not been applying removal rates of phosphate in Western Canada. Okay, so it's just the reality is like we're starting to see a lot of wheat yields, spring wheat touching 100 bushels an acre, right? And canola yields getting into the 60s and 70s quite regularly. Well, 60 bushels of canola removes, nearly 60 pounds of P2O5 per acre. So, yeah, and not a lot of farms are applying that much. So there's just a net balance there over rotation. That's a problem. The other thing we see is the effect of erosion. So, you know, low levels often don't occur across an entire field. And I
Right.
guess that's where our services and value come in, right? So what we often will see is again the knolls, and this often occurs again in the brown and dark brown soil zones, especially in Saskatchewan. A lot of historical tillage and summer fallow, and a lot of those knolls are very eroded, and all the phosphate gets blown away with the topsoil. And some of it ends up in the depressions though, right? It's not necessarily gone. It's not to the neighbor's farm. It's sitting down in the depression. So there's those low spots that grew all the crop this year in the drought, right? That's where all the phosphate is actually.
Drought. We're definitely familiar with that around
Yes.
these parts west.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. You mentioned lime in gypsum. Um, are enough growers thinking about this area and like because I don't hear a lot of discussion. It
Mm-hmm.
seems should it be more common of a topic? What are you telling clients?
I think I mean, as a whole, is, percent of farms that need to look at lime or gypsum, it's not still not super high, but yeah, certainly get into that black soil zone of Alberta, and it definitely, I mean, it's common to find at least some areas of some fields in the farm that are fairly acidic and would probably benefit from lime. It's just a matter of sort of economics. And what really bothers me is some of the short-term lease agreements, and get into land ownership and all that. It makes it really challenging because a lot of the time you're talking about maybe a 3 or even possibly 5-year payback,
Right.
because these are costly operations. Um, but yeah, I think it is getting talked about more in the areas that need it. and there's other agronomists recognizing there's some issues too. So that's good. There's companies like North Star Agriculture, dealing with cement kiln dust and using products other than sort of that true egg lime that ultimately has to come from in the mountains.
Yeah.
And freight just kills you. Like it's, if you're farming at Lloydminster to haul egg lime from, like Banff, is just the freight alone is unaffordable. So yeah, there's some other options. Wood ash too. We have some clients using wood ash, and that's another option in some areas. So yeah.
So with like the whole point of the message was, don't be so focused on N. Um,
Hmm.
do you think in some ways, like, okay, so I, I know I've had a lot of guests on that have said, like, okay, don't worry about the micros until you get the macros right. And you know more about all this than I do, so I'm maybe asking the dumb questions, but so in an effort to get people to focus more on things like N as one of the macros, the pendulum like is just like swinging too far, and we're sort of ignoring some of these other characteristics. Like, is that what's happening?
Yeah. Yeah, that might be a good way to put it, I think. Um, I guess one fact, I guess, I mean, we had quite a soil or tissue testing push this past season as well. So our team in Western Canada did a lot of tissue testing and even by zones and stuff to get a really good picture of what was going on in fields. And like nitrogen deficiency or anything below sufficient, really, like nitrogen was about eighth down on the list. Like like there's things like phosphate and copper and zinc were actually at the top of the list for the most common deficiencies, right? And the tissue test is sort of the ultimate blood test, right, for what the plants are seeing. I mean, it's sometimes there's things that go on in the soil that just simply don't allow the nutrients to be taken up. So a tissue test kind of is the be all end all to tell you what's going on. And yeah, it sort of, but it correlates with what we see in a lot of the soil tests too. So that's good. And yeah, I think the effort to really push yields and everything has resulted in some often higher than necessary nitrogen rates, or just um, yeah, or just sort of a lack of focus on the other things. So
How okay? So are you a big believer in tissue tests? And because everybody has an
oh
opinion on it. Like I know I'm open. This is a whole Pandora's box here. And the question, one of the questions I have to that is, how often should I be doing that kind of stuff? Like I've been to some of these high yield meetings that they have in the US, and it's like, doing tissue tests weekly. Um,
yeah.
that seems like a lot. I don't know. Maybe some people that is working for them, and I'm not going to be the judge at all here. I'm just trying to understand from a best management practice standpoint, is there
Mhm.
value in that tissue test?
Yeah, I mean, we've played with them a bit over the years and struggled at times. We've learned a few things. I
Okay.
will say that. I think we've learned that um, to really get much value at all, we need to take like at least two samples in a field, right? So you're either comparing a treatment within the same SWAT zone, so that you're, comparing apples to apples in regards to soil, but where we see the most value is probably tissue testing three SWAT zones within a field. So getting sort of the full breadth of what's going on in that landscape. So one up in the knoll where it's relatively dry, mid slope, and then more of a depressional area. And those have been really, really valuable. And then sort of comparing them to soil tests is just
Yeah.
sort of a complete picture, really. So
Okay. Now, before I let you go, I want to. I think you mentioned SWAT zones, and I think this is important. That kind of makes what you do and how you look at a field different than some others. Just talk about that really quick so that we understand kind of what you're talking about there.
yeah, well, we map the stable soil and water attributes in a field. So topography, water flow and accumulation areas, texture, salts, and put it all together in one map, essentially. So And the one thing that's essentially common between all SWAT maps is zone 1 is the driest part of the landscape, either due to texture, landscape position, or both. And then zone 10 is kind of the wettest. So um, yeah, it's a high resolution soil-based map made for soil applied inputs.
And not, and again, just not doing grid sampling, but actually looking at samples relative to those characteristics you just outlined.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, we're trying to divide the field up into 10 different areas, and each area is um, it has a lot less variance, or is similar to itself, right? So you can have an area over in one corner of the field, an area over in the other corner of the field that are very similar landscape position and soil texture and water potential, essentially, right? And then we can combine the like we're sort of combining those into the zone and soil testing them together.
Very cool. Okay, I got one more question. I promise. Then I'll let you go, Wes.
Mm-hmm.
So you've referenced Western Canada several times here. Is this issue now that the nutrients may be different, but is this whole premise of the large focus on N and ignoring some of the others? Is that also happening Central Eastern Canada, the US, Australia? What's your experience when you compare the Canadian samples,
Mm-hmm.
Western Canada versus some of these other geographies?
Yeah, I don't see a lot of the samples from our partners just when they sort of ask for help and a second
Okay.
opinion. But every geography is a bit different. So Ontario is very aware of potassium deficiencies and use, for example. I would say the US is a little bit better in respect to phosphorus and potassium as well. Australia actually is very aware of things like calcium and low pH. I mean, they have heaps of soil acidity issues. They do a lot of liming. It's just simply regular practice. So yeah, every part of the world is a bit different. And yeah, like some of these problems are a bit sneaking up and new to certain regions too, right? And soil acidity is one that's fairly new to Western Canada.
And we still have a lot of room for growth of people using VR in terms of getting
Yeah.
solving some of these problems.
Yeah, we certainly do. I mean, yeah, like there's probably only about 15% of the market in Western Canada that's variable rating right now, right? And then when we get into those applications like lime that might cost 150 or $200 an acre, it's almost the only way to go. It's the only way it's going to be profitable. So
Great stuff. Wes, we got to talk more often. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the insights and keep up the great work there at Croptimistic Technology. Really appreciate you joining me here today.
thank you.